Leptin is a hormone that is secreted by our fat cells, and it tells our brain that we have enough fuel on hand, so it's okay if we turn down the appetite and turn up the metabolism. So in theory, we want to have nice moderate levels of leptin with nice sensitivity to leptin. And what that means is that we want our brain to accept the signal from leptin with open arms. But we run into a really big problem. When you are overweight and you have a lot of fat on you, what happens is those fat cells produce so much leptin that the brain gets tired of receiving the signal. The analogy that I've used, it's like calling someone off the hook to the point where they finally don't pick up the phone anymore. So what we need to do is we need to find the causes of leptin resistance so that we can help the brain receive the signal from leptin again. If the brain receives the signal from leptin once again, we can jack up the metabolism again, and guess what? Appetite will be nice and controlled. But until that happens, we're going to be running around looking for food, ravenously hungry, while simultaneously gaining weight. Now the problem is that leptin resistance is bidirectional. And what that means in English is that when we are obese or overweight, we produce a lot of leptin and become leptin resistant. But leptin resistance in and of itself makes us overweight and obese because we store more. So which came first, the chicken or the egg? We don't really know. All we know is they both cause problems. Now, basic causes of leptin resistance, before we get into the ones that you can immediately correct, inflammation. Inflammation absolutely impedes the ability for that leptin to hit the brain properly. It's like static. The leptin just can't get to the brain well. High levels of free fatty acids in the blood. What that means is that you're eating a lot of high-fat foods and not moving, or you're eating a lot of carbohydrates that are turning into fat and not moving. Also, neurological changes, lots of stress, lack of sleep, overtraining. These are just blanket things, but let's jump into what you can do immediately. The first one is not giving yourself enough of a break from food. Okay, think about it like this. If you give your body a break from food, it allows leptin to come back down for a little bit. In fact, there was a study published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism that looked at just this. They had subjects do a 52-hour fast. Now, I don't recommend that you go jump out and do that. The point is that they found when subjects abstained from food for a couple of days, their leptin levels went down over 70%. Okay, what this means is that an obese person is secreting less leptin. And when they're secreting less leptin, it gives a chance for the receptor in the brain to start to warm up to the idea of receiving the signal again. It's like if you're calling someone off the hook, off the hook, off the hook, and finally they're just like, I'm not answering the phone anymore. But then suddenly you don't call them for a couple of days, well, they're probably apt to pick up the phone when you do call them the next time. And that's sort of what's happening here. Now, if we shrink this down to a relatable way for you to do it, sure, intermittent fasting might work for you, but that doesn't work for everybody. So what I recommend you do is have very clear, defined gaps between your meals. Eliminate the snacking so that your body gets a chance to restore its leptin sensitivity. It can make a huge impact, and it can make a huge impact very, very quickly. The next one is eating too many carbs that you're not burning. Now, I don't have a problem with carbohydrates per se. What I do have a problem with is consuming excess carbohydrates and not utilizing them. They should be used as a fuel. Okay, well, what does this have to do with leptin? Well, it turns out that triglycerides will make you leptin resistant. Well, triglycerides are technically a fat. So how does this have to do with carbohydrates? Well, with this, we look at a study. This study took a look at what are called radioactive labeled triglycerides. So basically, they took triglycerides and they labeled them with a radioactive isotope so that they could watch them inside the body. Well, they found that these triglycerides cross through the blood-brain barrier. We didn't know they did this. Okay, they cross through the blood-brain barrier and they end up in the cerebral spinal fluid. So they end up in the fluid that kind of circulates around our brain. But then what they found is that these triglycerides bind to a leptin receptor and end up making people leptin resistant. Well, what the heck? Okay, so triglycerides are bad if they end up in the brain. Well, fats cause triglycerides to get high, right? No. With that, we look at a paper that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. Put subjects on a lower carb diet compared to a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. And what they found was that the low-carb diet had a 20% reduction in triglycerides, and the high-carb, low-calorie, low-fat diet only had a 4% reduction in triglycerides. But what happens when you eat too many carbs and you don't burn them is those carbohydrates trigger an insulin spike. The insulin spike allows the carbohydrates to go into a cell, but they also go into a fat cell. And when they do that, triglyceride levels elevate. Now, this would not happen if you ate carbs and burned them, but most people eat carbs and sit down, okay? Now, compare this to a lower carb diet. In this case, a lower carb diet, insulin levels are low. And when the insulin levels are low, the triglycerides can then be broken down into usable fuel. So rather than triglycerides circulating around and going into the brain, they circulate and get broken down and used as fuel because the carbs aren't in the front of the line. But again, full disclaimer, if you're active, the carbs aren't going to be a big problem, but most people are not active. The next one is a lack of protein. Now this is interesting because there's a relatively recent study that demonstrated that when subjects consumed more protein, they were satiated. They were not nearly as hungry. But what they found is that it did not immediately impact leptin. However, long term, they found that when subjects were satiated and didn't need to eat as much, eventually it restored that leptin sensitivity at the central nervous system level. So what this tells us is that if we can control our appetite for long enough, leptin resistance will start to go away and we'll start to be able to rekindle this signal. The problem is that we're always hungry, but by increasing protein, we can kind of combat this. What you have to pay attention to as well is your gut microbiome. People don't realize that if the microbiome is out of whack, not eating enough fiber, not taking care of their gut, not being hydrated, this can impact your satiety significantly. Okay, the microbiome is almost like a second brain for us. And sometimes that second brain will override our real brain. And it can make us feel hungry when we're not really all that hungry. So protein is very good for the microbiome as well, whether it's plant-based or animal-based. It has a satiety effect, but it also has an impact on our microbiome. But I also throw fiber into the mix, things like asparagus, things like artichoke, chia, flax, because not only do they keep you satiated, but they impact the microbiome. Now, another thing you can do in addition to this, taking a good probiotic is very important. There's a link in the description for the one that I recommend. It's called Seed. So Seed is technically a synbiotic, where they have a technology to be a prebiotic and a probiotic in one. Now it's a capsule inside of a capsule, so really interesting stuff. Now, I don't want the takeaway of this video to be get a probiotic. I think you should eat these foods. I'm just suggesting that if you need a little extra help, I highly, highly recommend it. So that link is down below and also saves you 15% off. I candidly don't like probiotics, but Seed is in a different category. Okay, they do a lot of research, they fund a lot of research, they're really well known in the research community, so that link is down below. Give them a shot, I think you'll notice a difference. This next one may sound like a no-brainer, but it's really cool. Okay, this is really good for two types of people. Overweight people, but also people that have lost a lot of weight and their metabolism has slowed down accordingly. It's the right kind of exercise. Now, inactivity will actually impact your leptin resistance in a negative way. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition took a look at 186 men. They found that when they put people on a diet and they had them exercise, it restored lower levels of leptin and better leptin sensitivity. Now, at first it sounds like lower leptin would be bad, but in this particular case, the body's not having to produce as much leptin because the body is sensitive to it. What they found is that the exercise, if you're active throughout the course of the day, is anti-inflammatory, so that impacts leptin sensitivity significantly. They also found that it increases sympathetic nervous system activity. Okay, so when you're a little bit stressed out from a workout, just a tiny bit, that increase in stress and sympathetic nervous system activity actually lowers the need to produce more leptin. So you end up giving the brain that break that it needs. Now here's what's really cool. If you've lost weight, okay, if you've lost a lot of fat and you're worried about your metabolism slowing down, it turns out that as long as you're exercising while losing weight and not just dieting without exercise, what's going to happen is you're going to down-regulate what is called leptin mRNA expression. So basically, you start producing a little less leptin, but it's matched to your body fat. So that sounds complicated, and it kind of is. But what it means is you're resetting your body and you're resetting your hormonal levels based upon your new body weight. So the important note here is just because you lose weight with dieting doesn't mean that you're absolved of your duties to move your body. Moving your body is going to reset everything so you do not crash your metabolism. Okay, if we look at sleep, we know that sleep is important. But did we realize that sleep is sort of unconsciously making us like hungry or not hungry? The Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism had some subjects go through like a forced sleep deprivation, and then they had them go through a period of time where they were able to have adequate sleep. They found that the more the sleep was restricted, the lower the leptin was. Now, when you're listening to this, you're thinking, that doesn't make sense. I thought I wanted lower leptin. Well, you want lower leptin if you're not getting enough leptin to a receptor. Okay, what that means is like low levels of leptin are good if you're leptin sensitive. But what they found is that when you're sleep deprived, you remain leptin resistant, but you're not producing leptin either. So an analogy for this would be like, okay, in traditional leptin resistance, leptin is high and it's constantly calling the brain and the brain doesn't pick up. Okay, in the case of lack of sleep, you're calling infrequently, but the brain still doesn't pick up. It's like the end, right? I want you to imagine this. Imagine you have a girlfriend that you really, really miss, or boyfriend, or whoever's watching, right? Imagine, and they don't like you anymore, so you call them constantly, and they don't pick up. That's like normal leptin resistance. But then you get to a really sad, pathetic state where you're still only calling them like once a week, and they're still not picking up. Once a month, and they're still not picking up. It's the death of the relationship, right? So when you are sleep deprived and you're leptin resistant, it's like the brain doesn't want to receive the signal, and at the same time, you're barely even calling anymore. So it's just depressing, right? Well, that's what's happening here. But what they're finding is that when sleep is restored, this quickly comes back to life. So if you start sleeping again, it's like all of a sudden you can call and she picks up the phone again, right? So we have to keep this in mind. Leptin resistance is not as simple as it seems. But the best things that we can do, to recap, easy things: take breaks from food, increase the protein, prioritize the protein over the carbohydrates, because the excess carbohydrates are going to really be what messes you up. So prioritize the protein. Improve the sleep, which is going to improve your desire to eat protein. It's going to make it so you don't want to eat as many carbohydrates. And move throughout the day. Microdose your exercise. 10, 15 minutes here, multiple times throughout the day, instead of just destroying your body first thing in the morning. As always, keep it locked here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.